Just for those of you who were curious about why the Beit Midrash was full until about 20 minutes ago, and this transition, which set us a few minutes behind, the Institute ends its academic year around now. As some of you know, we, in addition to our academic year programs in Israel and our academic year programs in America, we also run 2 high schools. So their academic year formally ended earlier this week with graduation, and at the end of the year, the entire staff of the Hartman Institute, with a representation of Hartman North America staff that's here, gets together for a kind of year-end analysis state of the Institute, and then a very special ceremony which involves the awarding of awards to outstanding employees of the year. And I'm just mentioning it both because it was actually a special and emotional experience. I'll acknowledge our Hartman North America colleague who won the award this year, Ilana Stein-Hain, who you met before. But also because just in the spirit of the theme, it's always very moving to watch this ceremony and the way in which our colleagues are so happy for each other when people get awarded this award. And also there's something very flat about a ceremony that honors in the same group our scholars, our educators, maintenance staff, finance staff, and it's really just a moving experience. It feels like it feels Derech Eretz, given our topic for this year. What I wanted to do this morning actually connects in some ways to the talk that Tal did last night. And it builds up. Tal's talk last night, in some ways, is unsurprising as one of the central conversations that you would imagine would take place within the context of discussing ethics in the contemporary Jewish experience. In that, we seem to be operating under the premise, I think, and I say us, that is modern Judaism, modern Jews, seem to be operating under the premise or seem to be experiencing a sense that the primary theater of the ethical, the primary theater of the moral in the modern Jewish experience is actually the public square. The place in which ethics matter most, the place in which ethics seem to be much more significant, in which moral discourse is much more pronounced, is in realms of public policy, public behavior, and the public square much more broadly. In contrast, private transgressions, ethical violations that are more in the realm of the personal, are oftentimes excused in a climate in which the public square is the primary theater of the ethical as being less relevant to shaping the moral culture of the societies that we're actually in. I'll give you 2 examples. One is the phrase that's oftentimes used to justify, even from a libertarian perspective, to justify our not judging what people do on their personal lives, the phrase, what happens behind closed doors. Never mind the fact that oftentimes what happens behind closed doors is sometimes, from a libertarian perspective, just, yeah, let people do what they will do. But oftentimes closed doors are actually a public health hazard. Right? Things happening behind closed doors involves the shutting down of or the blocking off of all sorts of moral and ethical misbehaviors that because we say behind closed doors, we kind of give a pass to. Or to give a much more contentious example, because we might as well get into it, when the Access Hollywood tape came out during the 2016 presidential election, the president's excuse for his rhetoric was that his remarks about, his casual remarks about sexual assault were what he said were locker room talk. It's an interesting response, it's an interesting excuse for all sorts of reasons, but part of the kind of the semiotics of it, what it implies in terms of language, is that locker room talk is basically okay, right? That it's excusable because it is a conversation taking place in a place in which, behind closed doors, in other words, among men, and therefore, in that context, it's not a violation of the public order. It's simply the stuff that happens behind closed doors, and that, therefore, makes it, in some ways, excusable. Regardless of the issue itself, it implied a fascinating dichotomy that I can say whatever I want in the locker room or behind closed doors, and that doesn't damage the public square. In fact, what damages the public square is not the fact that people say these things, but that someone has the audacity to release the tape. That actually becomes much more damaging from a moral perspective than the fact that some immoral, assaultive conversation is taking place behind closed doors. In other words, or in contrast, public violations of the public trust tend to define our consciousness in our considerations of what is good and bad, much more than the private transgressions that are hidden from view. And if you had to make a kind of moral hierarchy, the fact that somebody fails in their own private doings between themselves and maybe their family members, between themselves and their tax returns, between themselves and their relationship to God, or even in their treatment of themselves, enters into our calculus as being far less morally significant than when people actually fail in responsibilities to the public trust as take place in the context of the public square. What this has done, in other words, is that we, and I really mean we, because I think this is not a partisan issue, might right now feel like a partisan issue, but it is really not a partisan issue, have basically, as political people, largely let go of a concern for personal integrity as relates to our leaders, including our politicians, so long as that personal integrity does not infect the public trust. As long as someone is considered a reliable custodian or curator of the public interest, right, we have, generally speaking, marginal concern for questions of personal integrity among our politicians. I hope that you're doing a calculus in your head of not just who are the politicians on the other side of the aisle for whom you consider this to be the case, but those in yours as well. I had a little bit of a reckoning personally after the Access Hollywood tape was released, because my initial instinct was to think of this, the presidential candidate speaking openly and comfortably about his history of sexual assault. Shouldn't that be a disqualifier? And I then started to think about the ways in which I, as a Clinton voter, during the impeachment hearings, felt much more scandalized by the fact of the impeachment hearings, in retrospect, than I really ever did about Clinton's own behavior. In other words, I had a partisan lens which made me more concerned about the consequences that were going to happen to the moral interests that I wanted for society had Clinton been removed for office, right? In other words, his moral transgressions were secondary and inferior to him as the representative of a set of political viewpoints that were going to be significant for the country that I cared about. And there's a legitimate argument, which we could play out, that we should be more concerned for the moral vision of a country and a society than the moral behavior of a particular actor. But in reality, what I was basically accentuating in terms of my own political sensibilities was not real concern for moral authority, but real concern for what we call realpolitik. You have to basically tolerate the ethical transgressions of the people who you are passionate about for their leadership, because you want the best people to run the societies that you care about, and you have to therefore make a choice between the moral vision for the society that you want or the moral vision for the leaders who you're ultimately supporting. Clinton, Trump, Netanyahu, who has been scandalized throughout his career with personal scandals. One of the most famous ones in Israeli society is the budget that the Prime Minister's office has for the Prime Minister's residence to buy pistachio ice cream. That's one of the big ones. He really likes pistachio ice cream. Now that one sits on the border between a personal transgression and the use of public funds. But in theory, if that money had been kind of just the catering budget for the Prime Minister's office, it would never have been an issue. It was partly an attempt to exploit what people saw as personal weakness and to use it, to leverage it, to try to make an argument against his legitimacy. Or my favorite example, Mark Sanford. Mark Sanford is one of my favorite examples, who 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 lies about an affair that goes on for a long period of time with one of my literally most favorite phrases that has ever entered into the American political lexicon, and I use it as a euphemism for a whole bunch of things. His excuse for why he disappeared for months at a time about the affair that he was having was, "I was hiking the Appalachian Trail." It's just an amazing phrase. Like, now, I challenge you over the course of this week, when someone asks you a question, to use the phrase, "I was hiking the Appalachian Trail," which not only did not wind up damaging his political career. Ultimately, I think he became governor afterwards. No, he became a senator afterwards. He became a congressman afterwards, and now he's actually been defeated in a primary by the Trump coattails. We have a broad justification that is taking place by our citizenry, especially in America, that believes that immoral gains for a society are much greater or worse in terms of public culture than the private peccadillos of an individual, and that inconsistency, and I think this is critical, inconsistency is irrelevant. Right? Even the darker version of the word inconsistency, which is hypocrisy, is basically irrelevant. It is functionally irrelevant. In fact, you oftentimes see this in conversations on the left of the response to Trump, of what it will look like for the left to mount a response, is to stop being so pure and stop being so holy, right? Figure out what is actually leverageable, right, of the populist move, and come up with a populist alternative that actually advances a version of public policy that you want for a society, as opposed to getting caught up in the private. Now, one consequence of this is the question of what this means in terms of who we imagine as our leaders. Right? There are huge consequences of this. It's a little easier as Jews to say, okay, well, that's politics in the public square, and we know that that's not really our values, although let's be honest, as Jews have made politics the primary discipline of modern Jewish life, there are very significant consequences for us to see that the leaders of the societies that we're in are reflective of values that we consider to be abhorrent. Because actually, politics is a Jewish business. It has been really since the turn of emancipation. That is where Jewishness has been transacted more than anything else, has been in the realm of the political. So even though we try to say our politicians don't actually have to reflect our Jewish values, oftentimes they are, and oftentimes we actually think that they do more than they do. But this carries over not just from our political leaders in the fullest sense, but also Jewish communal leaders. If you're willing to make the same calculus about your elected officials, why not make the same calculus about your rabbis or your federation heads or your heads of schools? Right? What does this institution represent? It may be much more significant than what the rabbi or the professional does in their own personal life. So he's a sleazeball. Have we managed to raise the funds that we need to take care of Holocaust survivors? That's more important. That is a public concern, and then therefore we become immune from the moral responsibility to hold accountable individuals for their failings, because we hold them to a standard of what they're doing for the public. This feels to me like a risk. We could talk more about whether it is or it isn't. A second risk, however, is that when morality is the central primary theater of the moral is in the public domain, by definition, the public domain is going to become much more contentious. When we imagine that morality is what we transact on a regular interpersonal basis or on a private basis, and out there is just politics, okay, so politics can be messy, but I haven't attached to politics such significant moral value of being the determinant of what is good and what is bad. But when the central theater of morality is the public square, then our fights in the public square are the types of fights that emerge when you divide the world into good and bad. Your political enemies, by definition, then become your moral enemies. Interpersonal, the private, and the spiritual ultimately become the things that we consider to be trivial. In turn, also, and there are huge consequences for our Jewishness more generally. We have consequences for our leaders. We have consequences for the contentiousness of the public square. But I would say we also have consequences for Jewishness itself. If the public square is the primary theater of the moral and the ethical, then all of Jewishness is going to become about the public square. If I care about being Jewish, and I know that my Jewishness is a discourse of good, I want to bring goodness, and the place where goodness is being talked about most is in public policy, then Jewishness is now a public activity much more than a private activity. This has been true actually for American Jews for a long time. John Wucher, I think I did this text maybe a few years ago if some of you were here on the Jewish Identity Year. John Wucher wrote in his Sacred Survival, was his kind of one of the famous books of his in understanding the American Jewish community. Sacred Survival Revisited was a take in which he was trying to unpack its central theses. I'm working on an essay called Sacred Survival Revisited, which feels fun. Wucher writes that American Jews built synagogues in the 1950s because they needed synagogues to be Americans alongside their neighbors who had other buildings that they congregated in. But even in the 1950s, American Jews overwhelmingly built synagogues even as they were ambivalent about what they were supposed to do in them. American Jews have, for the majority of the last century and now this century, deep ambivalences about religion and spirituality, but profound commitments to articulate their Jewishness as a discourse of public policy and the public square. We see this happening all over the place. Jewish organizational life is overwhelmed with a concern for social, political, and public responsibility. Virtually every rabbinic organization releases public statements on a regular basis, not about theology, but about politics. Rabbinic organizations in America are under enormous pressure for their constituency to be relevant. And if you're going to be relevant, you don't issue a new interpretation of a text from Maimonides. You don't issue new interpretations of Jewish spirituality, except maybe here and there a little bit for those committed stakeholders in that conversation. But you had better release a statement about the relocation of the embassy in Jerusalem. You had better release a statement about violence on the Gaza border. You had better take a position on immigration. And not just those positions in moments where it's abundantly clear that there is a compelling moral and Jewish voice that must be brought to the bear, but even in places where what you would describe as the compelling moral Jewish interest is at best ambivalent. You had better figure out whether the Jewishness that you bring to bear to the world has something to say in the context of social, political, and public. Otherwise, Jewishness becomes functionally irrelevant in some ways that it might already be. One of the costs of this as well harkens back to a talk that Ilana gave here a couple of years ago, differentiating between the sincere self and the ritual self. When do we do things, Jewishly or otherwise, because they reflect our sincere commitments? And when do we do things, Jewishly or otherwise, because they reflect our performative commitments? When do we act in the world ritually or performatively because we need to do something symbolic that shows the world who we are? Well, when the public culture when public square is the theater of moral responsibility, we are by definition going to be much more performative than we are sincere. When I really want to dig deep and understand who I am as a religious person, as a moral person, a lot of that work is actually, by definition, going to be in the personal. It's going to be in the private. If I'm in the business constantly of the perform self, right, then I am performing my identity as a Jew much more than I am interrogating it. I'm troubled by this for all of the reasons that I just shared. And I'm troubled by it, though, as a stakeholder in that very culture. In other words, I know that the answer to this is not simply, how do we wrest Judaism away from a public square, if that's the place in which the issues really matter? The answer can't simply be, what does a countercultural performance to those set of concerns actually look like? What I want to do to help work on this, and I think I have a good class, I'm not sure about the ending, so I'm Just warning you, if we hit a cliff and I stop, that's the end. But maybe at least it provides some of the fodder and maybe some of the texts to animate a continuing conversation. The central idea that I'm going to put out here is that I think that there is a meaningful moral and religious difference between these two theaters, the theater of the public and the theater of the private. And I want to play it out through a little bit of an intellectual history. That is, I'm going to argue, a little bit contentiously, because you're always going to be able to find examples in each of these discourses that no, it's not perfectly right, but I think there are big themes here. I'm going to suggest that the biblical story is a story of public ethics, and that the shift to the rabbinic story was a shift to private and personal ethics. And what I'll come back to at the end is, as a result, for all sorts of reasons, I think we as contemporary Jews are back to living in biblical times. I think that's part of our challenge, and I want to figure out what we do as a result of it. I think the political conditions that the Jewish people are living in are actually playing with what we consider to be the dominant moral and religious discourse that our tradition has. We are choosing, maybe not consciously, from within our tradition to build a Judaism that works for our political circumstances. And I want to acknowledge that and figure out each of their consequences. Because after all, a community that is based on public ethics has the challenges that I laid out and also enormous opportunity, right? If you actually believe that you have the potential, the power, the agency, the privilege, the affluence to actually shape a public square, well, great news. Now we're trafficking in those pieces of Jewish tradition that talk about the ways in which we are meant to be a light unto the nations, the ways in which we are supposed to be repairing the world. Lofty, big stuff. The public square gives us the potential to do dramatic, game-changing things for the world. Whereas if our business is in the realm of the private and the moral and the religious, we might not be in that business, but we might avoid some of those pitfalls around leadership and morality that I indicated at the outset. Which framework we choose, the public or the private, becomes really significant to how we hold ourselves accountable to our own ethical behavior and ethical instincts. So to do this, I'm purple today. We're going to walk through this story. The first category of texts, as I indicate, are, I think, what I want to call the Torah of public ethics and divine accountability, the Bible's framework for thinking about where ethics and morals takes place. By definition, when you say the phrase, anything that says the Bible's whatever is like saying Judaism's whatever. There are obviously counterexamples to what I'm suggesting here. It doesn't mean that there can't be still a big theme that's attempted to being argued within the context of this canonical tradition. And I want to give basically two examples, maybe three, from biblical tradition. The first three texts are all one example. Of how and why to think about the Bible as playing out that ethics are essentially the domain of a public square, and this is key, a public square for which you are responsible. It's not just a public square in which you live, but a public square in which you are responsible because you are the sovereign. When you are in charge, a few of you will remember this from earlier this week, when you are in charge, you are responsible. And responsible then in the public square means responsible for ensuring that that public square is actually a site of ethics. The first three texts reference are kind of a clean example of how public ethics matters in the public square by using the example of the people in your society who are in your society but are not yours. That is, the stranger in your midst. And here, again, our goal here is not to grab this text and to send it on its way on the behalf of a particular political campaign. Our goal right now with these texts is to see the way in which an ethical model is being created for where the theater of the ethical fundamentally is. First example from Leviticus 19, you shall rise before the aged and show deference to the old. You shall fear your God, I am the Lord. Notice, by the way, that one is not territorialized. You always have to do that. However, when I come to the next verse, verse 33, when a stranger resides with you in your land, you shall not wrong him. That is, in your land. There has to be some meaning to a shift where I say, if you are actually in charge of the strangers in your midst, you have special responsibility to those who are in a vulnerable status relative to you. You're powerful, you are the majority, and they are the minority, and that majorityness, that power, obligates your sense of responsibility to the other. Ostensibly, Jewish ethics in a public square where it's not your land means you should probably be nice to the stranger, but you might actually be approaching that stranger more from the perspective of they might be the one who's in charge, and therefore being nice to them is not really about morals, it's about intelligence, right? But in the context of a place that is your land, your responsibility to the strangers emanate from the fact that you are in charge of that public square, and therefore you are responsible to them, you shall not wrong him. And not only that, the stranger who resides with you shall be to you as one of your citizens. You shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Remember that time where you were vulnerable in someone else's public square? That now activates on you that when you are in charge of your land and you are in charge of your public square, you have to bring that discourse of morality into that public square to treat those others the way that you would have wanted to be treated. Right? To love that person as though they were you, and they shall be as one of your citizens. Now, this is a great little moment. If they are as one of your citizens, does that mean that they are bound not only to be treated that way, but do they also have equal responsibilities? And our texts indicate no. Switch for a second to source 3. It's kind of an amazing little text. Source 3 indicates to us, you shall not eat anything that has died a natural death, right? Nevela, right? An animal that has died that you haven't ritually slaughtered, you're not supposed to eat. But what can you do? Give it to the stranger in your community to eat, or sell it to a foreigner. For you are a people consecrated to the Lord your God, and kid, mother's milk, cheeseburger, etc. Right? The story that's being told in this text is, in theory, if that stranger who's living in the community of Israelites has not just the rights but the responsibilities of the Israelite, then you would say in the public square that you control, you not only have to treat that person well, but they have to obey in the privacy of their own home your rules also. But actually, I think the Torah is drawing a powerful distinction. When you control a public square, you have moral responsibilities to the other, but they don't really have the same responsibilities as you. Right? They are actually allowed, in the privacy of their own home, to violate the laws of kashrut. Right? So your responsibility to them transcends, in many ways, their responsibility to you. Let's play this out most dramatically, turn back to source 2. Because now you have this idea that the stranger in your midst, that is a responsibility that falls on your shoulders. It sits upon you to take care of them. And we get this incredible test case of what happens when a stranger in your midst violates the norms of your public square. Right? How do I treat someone who has violated the norms of the public square that I control? There came out among the Israelites one whose mother was Israelite and whose father was Egyptian. And notice the ethnicities are complicated in this text. So the first character has an Israelite mother and an Egyptian father. So he's a person of ambivalent descent. And a fight broke out in the camp between that half-Israelite and a certain Israelite. Right? So that person is... the Torah is giving us this example in order to actually also ask questions about ambivalent ethnicities. Is this person Israelite enough for this, or are they exempt from our rules because they're only half Israelite? And a fight starts between the half Israelite and the Israelite. There's a wonderful midrash on this text that asks, as a midrash can only do, what were they fighting about? And the wonderful midrash that is brought here by the rabbis suggests that the fight they were having is that this half-Israelite had no place to park his tent. The half-Israelite, right, if ethnicity in the Bible is based on whose tribe you're in, which is determined by the father, that changes later in Jewish history. If ethnicity is determined by what tribe you're in, he wanted to park his tent by his mother's tribe. And the people of the tribe of Dan said, you're not one of us, you don't get to park your tent here. Part of the reason the rabbis are doing that is because they're suggesting, which they will later do much more explicitly, that this guy's claim was correct. He should have been allowed to park his tent there. But how he went about making the claim for the legitimacy of his claim was wrong. And in order to make a counterclaim against a different Jew, he turned it from being a personal dispute to something that wrecked the public culture of the camp. Right? And how does he wreck the public culture of the camp? That son of the Israelite woman pronounced the name in blasphemy. In the context of the fight, he not only attacks this individual, but he utters the name of God. The word that's used here in the Hebrew is magnificent and strange. The word is vayikov, which has the same root as nikeva, as female. In modern Hebrew, it's a word that means punctured. He does something that punctures the name of God, which I want to suggest here is puncturing the integrity of the camp. He does something that punctures the integrity of the camp by uttering God's name in vain. And he was brought to Moses. Now, by the way, his mother's name was Shlomit, daughter of Dibri, the tribe of Dan. And he was placed in custody until the decision of the Lord should make clear to them. There's two questions here. Do the same rules apply to half-Jews as Jews? And also, we know we're not supposed to utter God's name in vain, but when someone does, what do we do to them? Even if I say that person should be put to death, remember, the Israelites haven't been in the desert all that long, and they don't have the rules all that long, and this is the first test case. Who puts him to death? Who's responsible? Is there a court that's supposed to do it? Is it God who's supposed to do it? Who ultimately is responsible for this punishment? And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take the blasphemer outside the camp. That's a clue. You did something of damaging to our camp. Now you're going to be removed outside of the camp, which is the first symbolic understanding that you can no longer be part of this public culture. And let all who are within hearing lay his hands upon his head, and let the whole community stone him. It's not just a person who gets punished because there's something about this that suggests that the violation of cursing God's name seems to be less of concern to God. It's not a violation against God. It's actually a violation against the community. This person in your midst, even though they're not part of your own group, has to abide by the public norms and the public culture of this group. Otherwise, they ruin the experience for everyone. Actually, in a lot of pluralistic contexts, when you try to bring kids or even adults together in pluralistic contexts, there oftentimes are norms that are created for religious pluralistic communities that are coherent with these, which is you can listen to your music in your own room, you can turn on lights, make phone calls in your own room, but in the public space, right, let's create a set of norms that create kind of a holy, hermetic atmosphere for everyone who is going to be participating. I think it emerges out of a text like this. And to the Israelite people says, anyone who blasphemes his God shall bear his guilt. So it's not just, by the way, lest you conclude from this that rule only applies to half-Jews. Oh, by the way, it's all of you. This one establishes the precedent, but it actually applies to everyone. If he pronounces the name God, he shall be put to his death. The whole community shall stone him. Stranger or citizen, if he has thus pronounced the name, he'll be put to death. Again, a couple of other rules. Verse 22, you shall have one standard for stranger and citizen alike, for I, the Lord, am your God. Right? The same rules for the camp apply to everybody. Again, you can still eat that roadkill in the privacy of your own tent, but things that you do that damage the public culture take place in public are to be punished. Moses spoke thus to the Israelites, and they took the blasphemer outside the camp, pelted him with stones. The Israelites did as the Lord had commanded Moses. The first central idea is that the context of the camp, the public square, shapes the moral disposition of the people, and there are a set of rules that apply mostly to the public square, and personal transgressions seem to be much less of our concern. Actually, you read through a lot of the Torah of the Jewish people in the wilderness, and of course there are mitzvot that apply to individuals. Of course there are obligations, ritual and otherwise, that apply to individuals, but so much of the ethos of the texts are about what the camp is responsible for, and, as you'll see in text 4, which we're not going to read closely, when you actually enter into the land, how you become responsible for the ethical culture of the land itself. When you are in charge, when you are responsible, and when you are the sovereign, a whole set of rules fall upon you to ensure that all sorts of foreign and corrupting influence don't wind up damaging your society. The last text I'm going to do, although this is a tricky one, so I want to throw the idea out here for you about the other way in which the public square from the Bible seems to matter more than the private transgression, is in the particular example of the adulteress, or rather I should say the suspected adulteress, who is tried in public. This is a fascinating test case. Why am I concerned about the suspected adulteress? And why would I then, if I am concerned about it, why do I punish the suspected adulteress by bringing her into a public show trial? Because what I'm really concerned about is public morality. Right? Much throughout history, whenever you had show trials like this, they were attempts not to, my view, wasn't really about policing interpersonal behavior. It emanates out of a fear that interpersonal behavior, especially when it comes to spouses, husbands and wives in this context, winds up being corrosive to the larger public. So my example here is less about the anxieties that I have about personal behavior and much more about the responsibility to adjudicate public moral failings in public. This is a remarkable and incredibly depressing text. One of the real struggles for many contemporary Jews is how to figure out what to do with the sota. It was hard for the rabbis. There's a great intellectual history of scholars of Rabbinic Judaism wondering whether, as we'll see, when the rabbis get rid of the sota ritual, of what happens to a suspected adulteress, are they making the situation as relates to men and women better or worse in their elimination of this? There's a whole history to that. But you'll notice just in Numbers 5 on page 5, to first notice that the text, before we even introduce the story of the suspected adulteress, starts with a whole other set of rules about removing certain people from camp who have become defiled. Again, the framework that we are working with is that certain people who get defiled defile the camp. So there are a set of private transgressions that you can do in the privacy of your own home that ostensibly don't defile the camp, but then there are other sets of failures which might ostensibly be something that would defile the whole camp. I'm not going to read the story of the sota inside. You can do that for your homework. I just want to be mindful of our time, and I want to do the shift. I want you to think about what it means to be more concerned with the private and public. I'll summarize for you what takes place in Numbers 5. The woman is brought into the tabernacle area. She stands before the Lord. She has to swear on God's name, which is scraped off of a parchment into water that she drinks. Again, here's the nice juxtaposition between this text and the Leviticus text, which is God's name has been desecrated in the camp of Israel. And in this context, it's desecrated in order to exonerate this person. But the public trial is about some fear that God's name has been desecrated in the camp of Israel. It's a tremendous public display of embarrassment. And one imagines that the central motivation for something like this is, if we adjudicate this in public, in general, our camp will ultimately be free of these types of transgressions. I call this a Torah of public ethics and divine accountability. The reason why public ethics work in this context is because God is there to hold the public responsible. And the Israelites and their leaders are there to essentially enact God's will. The public camp is supposed to be pure and pristine and clean and responsible. And the work of leadership in Jewish life is to ultimately sustain a pure and moral public culture. Does that mean that the Bible allows people to commit violations in the privacy of their own homes? Not really. You have other regulations that are supposed to govern that, but it does seem that the central thrust of this type of morality is to be concerned with public culture much more than with private. You can see why, right, in a modern Israel framework, you would be much more concerned with how are we treating the stranger, the widow, and orphan in our society in the state of Israel than you would with what do people do in the privacy of their own homes and in their interpersonal relationships. You understand why there is a discourse, a moral discourse that emerges authentically out of this tradition that says when you are in charge and when you are responsible for what happens in your midst. But I want to switch over to the Rabbinic because this is, I think, the great turn. The center of attention in Jewish history shifts after the end of sovereignty from the public square to the private domain. And I think one of the great moments when this shift takes place, I don't mean chronologically, but conceptually, is in this incredible text from the Babylonian Talmud, Avodah Zarah 18b. It's a tractate that talks all about idolatry. What's wonderful about a tractate about idolatry is that it's not really about idolatry. It's about Jewish life in the Roman Empire. And the question of what happens when you no longer control the public square is shaped by other people's moral and religious discourse, and you have to be a participant in a society trying to figure out when do you protest against that public square, or when do you erect versions of your own pristine moral communities that exist precisely because they are not in that public square. When do you stop saying, I'm going to advocate for a public square that's not mine, and simply make my Judaism come to life in the synagogue, the Beit Midrash, or the domesticity of my own home? That's the great rabbinic move, the shift from the public to the private. And it manifests beautifully in this text from Avodah Zarah. Our rabbis taught, those who visit stadiums and witness there the performances of sorcerers and enchanters, and then we get this list of Greek words that are rendered into rabbinic Aramaic or Hebrew, buko and makus and ludio and murio and bure and skure. What do these mean? I have no idea. I've looked some of them up. They're not exactly close enough to the Greek that you can actually figure it out. You have this weird thing that happens when you have a text like this, because the rabbis are describing behaviors and practices that are common to take place in stadiums with gladiators, in circuses, etc. Right? They know enough of the words to describe them, but they're ultimately going to polemicize against them. That's, by the way, same as it ever was with the polemicist. The better polemicists know in detail what it is that they're railing against. I'm going to talk about this more on Shabbat in conversation with Micha on technology, right? What it means to rail against something and how well do you have to understand it in order to be able to make an effective moral argument against it. Right? In this context, the rabbis are nervous that people are going to go living in the Roman Empire. Remember, this is not your public square. You are not at home here. You are a participant in someone else's public square. And you're going to go to these stadiums and these circuses, and you're going to see all sorts of things that seem like idolatry, right? Sorcery and enchantery. Lo, a person who goes to those stadiums, the rabbis say, this is the seat of the scornful, channeling from the book of Psalms. And those who visit them, Scripture says, happy is the man who has not walked in the counsel of the wicked, nor sat in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord. I'm smiling because if you've ever studied in a traditional Jewish institution, this is the birth of a phrase, Moshav Leitzim, a place where like jokers sit, and that is it's like common rhetoric for high school rabbis to say to boys. Like whatever it is you're doing, that's Moshav Leitzim. That's like playing around, right? Don't do that. This is not what you're supposed to do. Now it doesn't say don't go there. It says, like, that's not our place. That's morally trivial, right? This is not a condemnation of going into stadiums and circuses, but there's something there. It's not a place for a Jew to go. From here, you infer that those things cause one to neglect the Torah. Do you notice the central dichotomy that's being drawn here? Where are morals and ethics found? In places of Torah, which are, by definition, your private domain. Out there, bad. In here, good. The rabbis go on, however, but the following was cited to contradict the foregoing. It's permitted to go to stadiums, remember where gladiators are having these battles, because by shouting, one may save the victim. wait a second. Why would I be allowed to go into a stadium where there's a gladiator fight? Because maybe I can do what in the context of that stadium? Remember this whole business? If you know history, you don't know history, you watch the movie Gladiator, you get enough. If you do this, then you can advocate that the emperor or the governor who's in charge will actually spare the life of the victim. In other words, what would I do in the context of the public square? What gives me permission to go in the public square is not because I control it, but if there's an opportunity to play out some sort of moral outcome, right, for the victim, then I'm permitted to enter into that public square. It's not run a more ethical version of a gladiator fight, but it's maybe show up sometimes into a public square that is not your own in order to advocate for the good. If you don't show up there to advocate for the good, much worse things that ultimately will happen. One is also permitted to go to the camp for the purpose of maintaining order in the country, provided he does not conspire with the Romans. What's the other reason why I might show up to the camp? This is like good diplomatic Jewish politics. It's good for Jews to go hang out with Gentiles in the public square because ultimately this will make it better for the Jews. As long as you don't wind up crossing over to the other side. In other words, what I can do in the public square is I can advocate for the moral or I can advocate for myself. But I never assume that by participating in the public culture, I'm actually shaping the public culture, and I never assume that participating in the public culture is taking ownership for it because it is fundamentally not mine. This goes even one step further to the point where this is so much about us and not about them in the final piece of this text. These represent the differing opinions of two Tanaim, for it has been taught one should not go to stadiums for the seat of the scornful, but Rabbi Nathan permits it for two reasons. One, because by shouting one may save the victim. And then, what's the second reason? We saw that one already. The second reason, however, this is staggering, because one might be able to give evidence for the wife and so enable her to remarry. What's going on here? What do we now assume by the end of this text? You're not advocating for the victim who's some random victim who you're supporting. You're advocating for the victim because the only place that the Jew has in the public square that you don't control is as the victim. I now assume by the end of this text that the victim in the gladiator fight is a Jewish man. And if I show up to watch him get slaughtered, I can go back and testify to the court that he's actually dead, and that frees his wife and permits her to be remarried. So now I have to show up to the stadium, not because it's my place, but because I have responsibility to my own group. Imagine the difference here between thinking of yourself as transacting the moral because you control the public square, or merely interacting with the public square to pursue some moral or religious outcome for your own group, which defines in the most extreme possible way how you are fundamentally at odds with or opposite to that public square. Where are you religious and moral? In your house, in your synagogue, in your court. And you will only interact with, you will only transact with the public square to the extent that you can achieve some outcome for the house, the court, or the synagogue. This contrast is made even starker in the next text in Eruvin 22a. I'll read a short excerpt from about 7 lines down. The rabbi is quoting from the scriptural text of the Song of Songs, "Come, my beloved, let's go forth to the fields. The congregation of Israel spoke before the Holy Blessed One, Lord of the universe." Right? This is the Israelites speaking to God. And they say to God, "Lord of the universe, don't judge me," that is us, "as you would judge those who reside in large towns, who indulge in robbery, in adultery, and in vain and false oaths." That's city people. We're not city people anymore. Who are we? Right? In contrast, let us go forth into the field. Come, I will show you scholars who study the Torah in poverty. Right? We are the people, as it goes on to say, of synagogue and schoolhouse. We have domestic imagination in terms of what we see as our central moral and religious orbit. We draw a distinction Those cities, those are the places of moral turpitude. That public square is totally a failure. Yeah, I'll show up there if there's a Jew who's going to be a victim and I can pursue some moral outcome for myself, but I am imagining myself to be fundamentally moral, not in that context, but in the context of my private home. There's one other text that I want to do to play this out, and that's text 11. I'm skipping over the sota pieces here. The sota pieces, you'll notice the rabbis unmake the entire sota story, right? And basically argue, like, we don't want that business anymore of public culture. It's a beautiful story, but I want to get to these other couple of texts. The consequences of dividing between the public square, where we have limited moral agency, and the private domain, where we have powerful moral agency, is that sometimes we have to live with the possibility that what's going to take place in public is going to be really immoral. You have to kind of give up on the public square. There's a wonderful story here in Babylonian Talmud Sanhedrin 37b, imagining what happens when you don't really control the public culture and how sometimes you have to give up on the possibility of the right outcome happening. The Gemara taught as follows. The sages teach in a Braita. How does the court describe testimony based on conjecture? The argument that they're trying to work through is that when you actually witness a transgression take place that's going to be prosecutable, you actually have to see the event happen, and there's no such thing as circumstantial evidence. From the perspective of capital crimes in the Talmud, circumstantial evidence is not a thing. And I'm going to show you the most radical example of how not trusting circumstantial evidence means that you're going to allow for the possibility of immorality in your public square because you hold yourselves to a different standard. How does the court describe testimony based on conjecture? The court says to the witnesses, what if maybe you didn't see the crime happen, but what you really saw was the person about you were testifying running after someone else into a ruin, that is, in a place where nobody else is. There's no other possible criminal who committed the crime, and you pursued him, and you ultimately found a sword in his hand, dripping with blood, and the one who was ultimately killed is convulsing. In other words, you see two guys run into a place, and then you walk in, and one guy's holding a dripping sword, a sword dripping with blood, and the other guy's lying dead on the floor. They said, if you saw this, you saw nothing, and you can't testify to the murder. And by the way, this happened, right? It was taught in a Braita that Shimon ben Shattach said as an oath, like he really said, I will not see the consolation of Israel. That's how rabbis swear, right? That's a rabbi's promise. Like, hold me accountable to the redemption. If I did not once see one person pursue another into a ruin, and I pursued him and I saw a sword in his hand dripping with blood, conveniently his story matches the entire example that we were given, and the one who was ultimately killed was convulsing, and I said to him, wicked person, who killed this man, either me or you? There's only two of us standing here, so therefore there must be limited options in terms of who's ultimately responsible, but what can I do since your blood is not given over to me? As the Torah states, at the mouth of two witnesses or three witnesses shall he that die gets put to death. Not only did I not see you, but I'm only one person. Therefore, the fact that I know that this moral transgression that took place in this public square, it's obvious what was right and wrong. There's nothing I can do, right? I didn't witness it. The one who knows one's thoughts shall punish this man who killed another. The teleology of private transgression, when you don't control the public square, contrasts like when you're in charge of the public square, the whole community comes out and stones him. When you're not really in charge of the public square, you have to rely and hope that God will ultimately take care of the injustices that take place in public because it's out of your hands. The rabbis then tell this wonderful story to play out their imagination of that, you know what, guys, this is really going to happen. They didn't move from there before a snake came and bit the murderer and he died. So don't worry, this actually happens. There's something wonderful about this fantasy, right, that we hope God will actually remedy the difference between good and bad in public, in part because if I don't have the story of the snake biting the man, then the story that they're telling about the limitation of human ethics in public is overwhelming and depressing. I become nervous that God's actually not going to bring about good in the world, and all I can do is concentrate goodness in the context of the privacy of my own home. So I tell this wonderful story. Don't worry, God actually does this. God actually remedies problems in the public square, but really what that whole story does is a witness to my own powerlessness. It's a window into exactly what I'm scared of. I can control what happens morally in the privacy of my own home. I am terrified that my own powerlessness means I can't control or exercise any power over what takes place in the public square. Now, in terms of the consequences. So what then, if there is a fundamental difference between what takes place in public and what takes place in private, what do private ethics fundamentally look like? What does that actually mean to value the private, what I do in private over public? And I want to give a couple of examples, and then I'm going to hit the cliff. The first is source 12. This is an amazing little description by the rabbis, and it makes sense to me only in this context of the rabbis trying to tease out the difference between a thief and a robber. A thief and a robber, the thief is the one who steals in private, and a robber who is the one who steals in public. Right? And according to the students asked Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, for what reason was the Torah stricter with a thief than a robber? Why would you be stricter with someone who steals in private than who steals in public? For only a thief is required to pay double, fourfold, or fivefold payment, but a robber merely has to restore the stolen item. Why is it that I think that it's worse to steal from someone privately than to steal something out in the open? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said to them in response, this one, the robber, equated the honor of the servant to the honor of his master. And that one, the thief, didn't equate the honor of the servant to the honor of the master. The robber, the one who steals in public, fears neither God nor people, as he's not afraid to rob in public. The thief does not fear God, but he does fear other people, which demonstrates that he's more concerned about humans than God. Right? In other words, what the rabbis say is, at least when you do things in public, you have something policing your moral disposition, which is shame. When you violate ethical norms in private, you have no shame, because you actually are standing in front of God, but you're willing to steal in God's presence. You're scared of people, but you're not at all scared of God. This, to me, feels like the code at the center of what a notion of rabbinic ethics is. Why are the rabbis so concerned about moral behavior? It's not just in private. It's not just about the difference between living in the public square and the private square. It's that once I live in the realm of the private, all I have left is yirat shamayim. All I have left is fear of God. That is the central instrument that is going to guide me as a moral person. It's not about what I can achieve in public, and it's not about being policed by shame in public. The central thing, the central idea that's holding me intact as a moral person is whether I see myself standing in the presence of God and whether that creates for me a sense of fear and awe. And if you don't, what do you have? If you can't hold to the integrity of being a person morally in private, then you have nothing. You have no instrument to establish your legitimacy as a moral actor. Now, I don't think you need to get stuck on this as a theological yirat shamayim, a theological fear of God. You know, if you don't want that mode, make the yirat shamayim an ethical conscience. Make it a moral fiber. Do you see yourself fundamentally held accountable to something moral, something even Kantian, some notion of the good that holds you to what you're supposed to do, regardless of the fact that no one's watching? This, the rabbis seem to place on a pedestal as a much more significant theater of whether a person is actually moral. Not how they behave in public, but whether they see themselves as accountable to something that is bigger than themselves. It gets played out even further in this wild little text from Baba Batra 88a. There's more even here, but in Baba Batra 88a, just this one line on source 13 on page 17, Rabbi Levi further stated, ordinary robbery is worse than the robbery of holy things. Ordinary robbery or stealing from people, Stealing holy things is stealing God's possessions, the things that were donated to the temple. That's ludicrous. Wouldn't it be worse to steal stuff from God than it would be to steal someone else's wallet? From the rabbi's ethical perspective, right, God at least holds you accountable in some way. When you can do bad things to other people, when you operate in the realm of the domestic and the interpersonal, you are not holding you have no fear of anyone. You have no fear. You have no fear of anything. This locates itself. This idea of Yirat Shamayim finds itself in the prayers, the morning prayers. If you look at source 14, in this phrase, Le'olam yehe adam yarei shamayim beseter uvegalui. A person should always be God-fearing privately and publicly. Actually, there's versions of this text. I think the original version of the text, but I can't prove it yet, is that it's really Le'olam yehe adam yarei shamayim beseter. You're fundamentally supposed to fear God in private, and they add the public because it kind of, you should do both. But the real novelty, the real novel move is the idea of fearing God privately, because no one else is holding you accountable. The moral person is the person who, in the privacy of their own home, holds themselves to a moral standard, not because, A, they don't control the public square, so they're not out there, but also because out there you have a discourse of shame. And here, all I have is my own fiber, my own moral instinct. Right? And I'm supposed to stand up in the morning and do this. And I have this wonderful midrash on this, on the bottom of page 18, on the very idea of Yerei Shamayim Beseter. There was once a person who was God-fearing in private. Tana Devei Eliyahu is a rabbinic midrash that dates from somewhere between, and I'm not making this up, the early 3rd and the 10th century. I like that about rabbinic literature, that you could have a text. Imagine if you were like, I'm reading a book, it was either written in 1987 or in 1311, right? It just gives you a sense of the fluidity of the rabbinic tradition and the way these ideas and these texts moved over long periods of time. It so happened that there was a certain priest who was a God-fearer in private, and all his good deeds he would do in private. Right? This was his noble morality was that it wasn't about doing anything for others. It wasn't about public culture or the public square. He was a God-fearer in private. And he had 10 children from one wife. I think she's the hero in the story. 6 male and 4 female. And each and every day he would pray and prostrate himself and beg for mercy and lick up dust with his tongue. Right? He would be so prostrate to the ground, humbling and humiliating himself. That's what his discipline of self-care was about, in order that not one of them would commit a transgression or some other befoulment. Right? He prayed not only for himself, but he prayed on behalf of them. And they said about this person that not 3 years had passed from when he was known for this, that before Ezra came, so this goes back a long time, right, before the return of the exiles from Babylonia, and the Holy Blessed One brought the Israelites out of Babylonia through him, and that priest among them. And that priest didn't pass until the next world, until he saw high priests and young priests from the line of his children and grandchildren for 50 years. He lived another 50 years to actually witness what? The transition back from the world of the private to the world of the public. It's magnificent. He is living in Babylonia in exile, where the central commodity of what a religious and moral person is about subjugation and sublimation in private. And the reward of what he gets is that when they return to sovereignty, his children and grandchildren are the high priests, the moral exemplars of the public culture. And only after that the priest passed into his world, and about him it is written, trust in the Lord, do good, dwell in the land and enjoy safe pasture, take delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. I think there's something deliberate about the use of this verse. Trust in the Lord and do good comes before dwell in the land and enjoy safe pastures. The journey switches, right? My loyalty to goodness precedes my occupancy of the land and what cultural responsibilities come as a result of it. The last text I'll look at is on the last page, on page 20. We know that Maimonides, this is like a therefore. We know that Maimonides' highest threshold of charitable giving is actually enabling another person to stand on their own feet. But just one level below this is an idea that is so critical to how we understand moral behavior, which is matana beseter, a gift in private. And in text 8, on paragraph 8, just one level lower than this is the person who gives tzedakah to the poor and does not know to whom he gives, and the poor person does not know from whom he receives. Right? It is still better to teach a man to fish, right? That's the first text here. But just below that, because I'm enabling another person to stand on its own, just below that, and still a lofty and noble idea, is the idea that to really be a moral person is to make possible for goodness to happen in the world without seeing or being seen. That there's something about private moral behavior that is so powerful and so lofty and so different than the business of trying to make goodness happen in the public square. In the American Jewish community, this is an amazing thing. In the American Jewish community, charity is less commodified than philanthropy. Charity is helping people without anybody knowing. Philanthropy is a commitment to the public good. Now, I'm not disparaging the work of philanthropy. There are names on buildings all over this institution, and our institution lives and dies on it. We need it. In fact, I also know that in a public culture in which Jews live publicly, you're going to have to transact with a morality of trying to shape and define a more ethical and more moral public square. And the technologies to do that are not gifts in secret, not little things that help one another that nobody knows about, but are world-changing behaviors. The kinds of audacious philanthropy that we've seen in the last few years, and we will see for the next 20, 30 years, from the Gateses and the Zuckerbergs and others, people with untold wealth who can actually look at a world social problem and say, we can fix that, right? That is evidence of a world that commodifies goodness as essentially about the discipline of the public square. But I am left with this voice in our tradition, born out a little bit, I think, out of Jewish powerlessness, and also a recognition that there's something else to be found in what goodness looks like when it is in the private domain. When the theater of the ethical is the public square, I have shame, I have responsibility, and you have high stakes because it's yours. The biblical model that we saw has a hermetic community that you're responsible for, but also a political community. You have a promise of big reward, and you have a risk of some hypocrisy, which we forgive. You can be a hypocrite, but still a great philanthropist. When the theater of the ethical is the domestic and the private, the stakes are about personal integrity, and the only thing I have is some notion of personal accountability. It seems like I even have power over God. If you're not scared of God, there's something that you actually have power over God, because maybe a snake will come and bite you, but the likelihood is that it won't. And I have some responsibility to do good without an obvious promise of reward. Political conditions in the 19th and 20th century have so dramatically changed for the Jewish people, with both Zionism and American Jewish at-homeness, that we see ourselves much more today as responsible for public cultures than we do as responsible for personal morality. We have reshifted back the theater of the ethical to the public square, transformative philanthropy, social action, social justice, the Jew in the world, than we have in the realm of the private. I think this is by and large good news. The shifting political conditions for the Jewish people have been, by and large, good news, and I am excited by the moral possibilities for the Jewish people about what happens when we go back to the biblical model, and if we do it right, if we take responsibility for our societies, in what ways we make possible for God to actually be in our midst. But I do feel concerned, and here I don't have a great answer, that we also have to figure out how to be inheritors of the other tradition as well. That maybe some of the ways in which we are compromised has happened because we have forgotten the rabbinic in the pursuit of the biblical, that the transformation of the modern age paradoxically retreats us to an earlier phase in Jewish history, and that there's something about rabbinic ethics, the privatization, the domestication, and the sense of self the holy sense of self that comes with thinking about ethics as a private domain that I think we need to hold on to. Thank you. Okay. Yes?
To what extent do you see the reemergence and popularity of Musars in attempts to address exactly this?
Great. So the question is, to what extent is the reemergence and popularity of Musar, the traditional discipline of spiritual self-challenge or self-care, as contributing to this? I would say, by and large, yes. I've always been skeptical personally of Musar because I have seen the ways that certain aspects of the Musar tradition have been psychologically damaging to people I know and care about. That if because sometimes some of the discourse of Musar involves a kind of self-negation or a self-abnegation that can actually be psychologically damaging, and sometimes can create, it's like, how can you both be a priest who lies on the ground and licks dust and also have a legitimate sense of self-worth? The Musar invites us to lean towards the ground and lick up dust, and done in ways that are psychologically and morally cautious, I think is maybe part of that vehicle. What I want to think about and what I'm curious about is, and I've heard from a number of our friends who are here this week for our board meetings, an awareness that as our business is so much about public and political culture, where is the pursuit of the spiritual? And that's part of this same question as well. Musar, the pursuit of the spiritual, maybe in some ways that's the reverse of, as I'm indicating, and maybe the antidote to this problem. But I also don't want the domain, I don't want at a time in Jewish history when we actually are in charge of the public square to abandon it in pursuit of the spiritual. Right? There is some, by virtue of the fact that I've created a dichotomy, it creates the risk that we actually preserve those dichotomies, and that the business of spiritual self-care involves the abandonment, right, and the fleeing from public responsibility in search of the self. And the worst risk is that a fixation with the self actually becomes narcissistic, because that's not what the rabbis are talking about at all. So there has to be some way of living with both of these. Yes? Arthur?
I'm curious about your wisdom and an intersection between the public and the private in the area of tainted money.
Tainted money?
Not the concept that we're tainted out with it, but the concept that the tradition, if I read correctly, actually allows for it. Our contemporary sensibilities are different. What wisdom have you brought to this area?
Question is about tainted money and the ways in which our tradition allows for it, but our sensibilities might not. So, my teacher, Rav Amital, who was the Rosh Yeshiva at Gush Etzion, had this great line when students would ask him about using non-traditional songs and music if you were like leading services, could you use, a pop song for Kedusha? And his phrase was, and I'll say it in the original and then translate it, it says, "Nigun lo mekabel tum'ah." A song, a nigun, is not eligible to acquire ritual impurity. It sounds better in Hebrew. What it essentially means is like music, a song is morally agnostic, and using it in a spiritual way actually is totally fine. And the same way that, like, in its non-spiritual context, it might be impure, but the activity is impure, not the song itself. I basically feel that way about money. I think that money is a morally neutral. It is, by definition, a commodity, and I'm not sure I accept the idea that money is morally tainted. Because it was acquired in one way or another. It's different if you talked about, if you actually have legal categories, because our halachic tradition has a lot to say about something like, for instance, are you allowed to use a stolen lulav? And they are no, because you have to be able to have ownership. But in most cases, when our community talks about tainted money, what we're really talking about is, yeah, there was probably, maybe something illegal, but if the money is still there and it hasn't been clawed back, it's actually more about something else. And it's not really about, what, did you say yet? Yes, maybe. It's not really about that question, but whether or not it actually can't be deployed for the public good. And I guess in that context, I would be on the side of differentiating between what's the moral work that someone who's been in the business of acquiring that money has to do, which is in the business of the rabbinic ethics, and in what ways can that money actually advance the public good, which is in the framework of the biblical ethics. Yes, Ray.
It was actually a similar question, but I was thinking of something else, Yehuda. Do you look at the private and the public accountability in Israel with sovereignty and control of the public space versus in North America where we are actors?
Yes. So this is a great question. Do we see differently this story in Israel versus America? Israel, a place of Jewish sovereignty, and the American public square in which Jews are maybe merely players. I don't know if you use that. So what I would say is I think like 5 or 6 years ago, I was more enamored by that distinction. In fact, I gave a talk on that in summer of 2011, that the fundamental distinction between the American Jewish experience in some ways and the Israeli Jewish experience is control over the public or living in the context of the private. I'm no longer enamored by it because I think the conditions for Jews in America, not in 6 years, but over a long period of time, have so significantly shifted that I think that the gap between American Jews and Israelis is no longer one just of they are citizens of a public square and we are citizens of a private domain, which would be easy to reconcile because you can have both at the same time, right? I can be a Jewish person in America and say, and I gain something from engaging with the project of Jewish control over sovereignty in the public domain over there. I think part of what is so challenging about the present moment is that American Jews are functionally Israelis at this point in America. I don't mean just because there's like a sixth of American Jews are Israelis. I mean because American Jews act in America much more like Israelis in terms of no longer seeing ourselves as a minority, but actually seeing ourselves as part of the shaping of the very society that we're in. Citizen and stakeholder, the terms of citizen and stakeholder I think have significantly changed for American Jews, and the only reason why most American Jews haven't internalized it is because if you actually internalize it and take it seriously, your degree of responsibility for that culture goes up dramatically. American Jews haven't internalized it for that reason. Like if you are an owner, you are responsible. And so the minute I admit that I am affluent, influential, powerful, and privileged, then you have a lot of work that you're supposed to do. And so I'd rather not acknowledge it. And also because Jews have superstitions in diaspora about claiming that they've actually become at home. Legitimately earned superstitions about claiming that we're at home. But I actually think that my frame of the biblical is actually true on both ends. I think both American Jews and Israeli Jews, and one witness to this, by the way, is watching Jewish organizations now around moral questions. Jewish organizations no longer seek to simply influence the Jewish community. They seek to actually shape the public culture. And once you've done that, you have seen that your constituency, the constituency of Ben the Ark is no longer the Jewish community. The constituency of Ben the Ark is the American people. Yes, Gal.
Is there, have contemporary Jews misinterpreted the biblical heritage and not quite seeing that the biblical leaders themselves were deeply flawed and thinking of public morality as purer than it really is? In other sense, when they're creating these organizations to do good, are they skipping over those parts of the Bible where the engagement with public morality is very messy and the leaders are flawed?
So actually, I think the flaw and failure of our leaders is actually they're doing a pretty good reading of the flawed morality of biblical leaders. But But in that context, what I think they're skipping over is the rabbinic tradition. The rabbinic tradition that is asking us to not merely look at, that doesn't define moral leadership, moral integrity, the pursuit of the good, as merely the pursuit of the good for the collective, not merely the pursuit of the good for the camp, for Machaneh Yisrael, not simply the pursuit of the good for what you would call public policy in a sovereign place that you can control, but actually a discourse of personal moral responsibility that is in which you are held accountable simply by your own moral instincts. That I feel is actually the skipped over piece. There's enough biblical stuff. There are so many good biblical analogies between the flawed leaders of today and those of the Bible. Micha will speak about this also, about David and Saul and templates for problematic leadership. I think part of the challenge is there something useful precisely in the rabbinic tradition, which is emerging at a place and time that's not connected, doesn't have the same types of analogies to the nature of Jewish political power, that actually might be a useful counterweight to some of those biblical instincts. Shelley, I'll take that, I think is the last one.
I wanted to go back to your two examples at the beginning and ask about how you might bring the private and the public together. So there is an argument that the personal and private ethics of our public figures are relevant because they influence and they impact how they will act in the public sphere. And so we need to think about that, and we can and legitimately can judge their private behavior. And then there's an argument on the other side, which I'm just wondering, so where would you bring this tradition that you shared with us now into that question? Can we look at the private?
Yeah, thank you. I wrote a piece about this around the time of the election, a piece that I published on Medium called "In the Company of Men," on trying to kind of watching the presidential debate with my two sons, and this was right after the Access Hollywood tape, and then I had to kind of explain to them what was going on, and then if you remember, Trump went after Hillary Clinton because of Bill Clinton's indiscretions, and then I had to explain to the kids what that was about. And the only thing that, the only reason why it was a somewhat manageable conversation is because they had already listened to Hamilton, and so we had dealt with the whole Mariah Reynolds scandal from the 18th century, and therefore, they already knew that this was possible. In other words, it wasn't a politicians never do these types of things. It was more like, oh, that's the song that Mommy usually skips when we get to. It was something else. So, I guess there's a few sides of this. One is that part of what's demoralizing about that conversation is having to induct children into a young age of the recognition that not just human beings are flawed, that's actually relatively easy, but that people who are seen in public as leaders are deeply flawed, and trying to figure out on the good side how to normalize that, because actually that should be normalized. But what you're asking is actually the harder work, which is, do we want to actually hold leaders to a different standard and not simply become immune to these types of behaviors, but to challenge our leadership to stand up to it? And the central moral reason why we would do that has less to do with public policy and has actually much more to do with victims who are oftentimes lost in this story. I've been enthralled for the last few years at watching and reading what Monica Lewinsky has been writing and speaking about in America. If you haven't watched her TED Talk, you must watch it. It's like must watching. Basically, she starts it off by saying, when I was 22 years old, I fell in love with my boss, right? And that whole thing changes the frame from her being a footnote in history, from she's the direct consequence, much more than the American people are the direct consequence of the moral failings of our leaders. So I guess what I would say is part of what we have to live with is some of these moral flaws, and we do have to kind of continually say to ourselves, we cannot, if we were in the business of that the only elected officials we could have were moral exemplars, we wouldn't have any, or they would be insincere or narcissists, right? As moral exemplars often are, or they might be really lousy politicians, right? So we have to, in some ways, come to terms with that. The place that I want us to, that the rabbinic tradition might actually help us, is not in correcting our leaders from not being morally flawed, but focusing us on what are the actual consequences of their moral actions, which are other human beings who tend to, in moments like this, leave our field of vision. I'll stop there. Thank you, everybody.